casualties of men and women on the battlefield. The important thing for the Ministry of Defence is 287 claimed conflict-related sexual assaults or violence in Ukraine pointed at the Russian side. So I just want to say, Mike, the cynicism of the UK at the moment in keeping this war going and keeping fighting until the last Ukrainian is truly appalling. And I'm sure there's many old Labour supporters who are now deeply shocked to see that Keir Starmer wants to keep this carnage going.
And we should just make the point again, as we made last week and in previous programmes, sexual violence is a weapon of war. Can't be a weapon of war if there isn't a war. So surely the first thing to do is to stop the war instead of trying to use it to justify the continuation of the war, which is really cynical. Okay, if you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, the place to go is support.ukcolumn.org. There are options to help us there. We do need your continuing support. Membership is £5 a month, and that really does help us. Thank you very much to everybody that is a member or contributes in another way. As we've mentioned many times, the algorithm is against us, so we need everybody to become the algorithm and share our material everywhere you can. The best place to find it in the first place is ukcolumn.org or ukcolumnextracts.co.uk. You could pick something up at the UK Column shop. Lots to have a look at there, and of course your life in their hands,
which I'm going to keep asking for every person who's a member of UK Column to buy. I will put some up in future news editions, but we've had a number of very nice emails from people talking about the quality of this publication and saying how good it is. So if you haven't purchased one yet, please do, because it's good material, it's good value, and it really helps the UK Column. Now, just on the subject of Trump, I think that some people might be unaware that J. Michael Waller did two really good interviews with me, specifically talking about problems with the security services in the United States, and that includes the CIA and the FBI, and he's talking about the breakdown in performance. So if you haven't seen those interviews, get online and have a look, because I think they're highly pertinent to the assassination attempt on Trump. And coming out tomorrow, the 16th, 1 o'clock, we've got my second interview with Dr. Michael Nels, where he's talking about Alzheimer's and what people can do in order to stay fit and healthy and to keep their mental capacity until mature years. So this is something which will be of value to all of us. And I'd also like to say that John Bodwin, who is an American who's produced essentially an algorithm which is able to process death data in the States, has obtained 1.4 million death certificates, which he's now able to process. And at 1 o'clock on Thursday, that's this coming Thursday, there's an interview with John and Debbie Evans where he's talking about the amazing work he's doing to expose what is really happening to people's health in America. And I'd also like to say, make sure you get that Saturday the 19th of October this year in your diary, for a location in Bristol, still to be announced, which will be UK Column appearing really, really, really live. And we'll look forward to meeting you all there.
Okay, now in a minute, Mark will be talking about more on NATO and what's been following from last week's events. But just before we get to that, one of the things that NATO published following their major event last week was their industrial capacity expansion pledge. It's a fantastic document. Everybody will appreciate it, absolutely. And you'll particularly appreciate it if you've been paying attention to the UK Column for a number of years, because we've been talking about this for a lot of years now. Here's a key quote: "We will leverage the alliance's role as convener, standard setter, requirement setter and aggregator and delivery enabler to expand defence industrial capacity. So when we've been talking about EU Defence Union, we've been talking about its connections to NATO. We've been talking about the industrial aspect of this, which is absolutely key. So if we bring it back on screen again, they have issued a pledge, and they pledge to strengthen defence industry across the alliance, to increase large-scale multinational procurement, to accelerate adoption of new technologies, and to enhance interoperability and interchangeability. This is amongst several other things that they're pledging. And the key thing here, Brian, is what we're looking at is single point command and control. This is the term that David Ellis used to use. It's a really key point aspect of this and of the European Defence Union, so-called single point command and control and single point procurement. So a centralized organization decides, effectively controls what each member state is able to do, what they're able to purchase, and where they're able to purchase it from. And of course, this is the tying in of the military and industrial complex to these supranational structures, whether it's at EU level or NATO level, and it's extremely dangerous because it's effectively corporatizing everything that they do.
Indeed, and the lid has got to come off this at some stage. The irony is that, of course, Russia producing its own ammunition and equipment and military vehicles is easily outstripping the West combined. And of course, the problem with the European and the NATO system is that you've got too many disparate producers of equipment, and you've got this constant coordination problem, which is now demonstrating that it's full of holes. But yes, they keep pushing.
So to just give you an impression of this, each nation will be permitted to follow its own national plan, but the plans will be shared and coordinated through NATO. So could you explain to me how that works? How are you permitted to follow a national plan if the national plan has to be coordinated through NATO?
Well, as we said last week from the MOD document from 2018, we are looking for the nation state to disappear in about 30 years' time. So I think they're preparing for it, Mike.
Yes, all the way through this, by the way, probably no need to mention it, though, it's NATO, Ukraine, and Ukraine is the justification for this merging and creation of this, embryonic one world military infrastructure.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. And it's going to be interesting to see how close the Americans decide to be with this chaos and mayhem in European NATO. But as I've said many times, that in years gone by, Cold War, the power within NATO was invariably the US as the overwhelming power, followed by UK, followed by the Germans and the Dutch. And after that, it was people came in on a very ad hoc basis.
With the French at the bottom, right?
Well, the French were always off to one side because they didn't want to play by anybody else's rules.
Yes. But Mark, let's get a little bit more from you on the NATO summit.
Yes, I managed to sit through about 2 hours of it July 10 and about 6 or 7 hours of it July 11. Challenging to stay awake at times, but there were a number of interesting points. Of course, 75 years for the alliance. I mentioned this last week, the 12 initial countries that signed the North Atlantic Treaty. It's now 32 countries. So since the initial treaty was signed in D.C. way back when, 1949. Now they wanted to meet in D.C. again. That was the whole meaning of it. And we'll comb through this. The next couple slides are simply the daily schedule, day 1 and day 2. I'm not going to read them. They're just there for those that want to reference them and freeze those slides. Viewers can do that. And so that's just kind of a convenience there. We'll move on. Day 2 in the public forum featured this Congressman, Gerald Connolly from Virginia, a Democrat, and he announced that 31 of the 32 NATO countries now support a relatively new thing called the Center for Democratic Resistance. So they're looking at NATO not just being a military thing, but supporting democracy, being more of a political thing. And he is a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. Connolly, which is a body within Congress that I didn't happen to know existed. Now, I traced it back. Here's a press release from April of 2022, and that's when this thing was sired. House passes Connolly-Turner resolution in support of establishing a NATO Center for Democratic Resilience. Today, the House passed House Resolution 831, a resolution in support of the establishment of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO to help member, partner, and aspirant states strengthen their democratic institutions and to preserve democracy around the globe. That's what they're saying it's for. The resolution was introduced by Congressman Connolly, president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Congress, like I mentioned, and Congressman Michael Turner, an Ohio Republican and a former NATO president in that same organization, the Assembly. Passage of the resolution comes ahead of the NATO's PA's standing committee meeting in Athens, Greece. That was at the time. Nothing real important there specifically. And we'll keep moving. Connolly first proposed the creation of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO going as far back as 2019, a recommendation then endorsed by the NATO Parliamentary Assembly as a whole. In 2020, the independent group of experts on NATO 2030 supported the concept in their recommendations to the NATO Secretary General. In April of 2021, the Assembly established a working group to advance the proposal concept for the center. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, speaker at that time anyway, endorsed the proposal in October of 2021 while in Lisbon, Portugal, for her acceptance of the NATO PA's inaugural Women in Peace and Security Award. The bipartisan U.S. delegation to the NATO PA has also encouraged Secretary of State Blinken, he's still the Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense Austin to build support among allies for this center. So that was a U.S. Congressman's role at the NATO Public Forum. Covering this, I couldn't, of course, cover this summit directly. That's behind closed doors. NATO rolled out this public forum for the 75th anniversary largely as a PR thing. Here's what Connolly had to say, anyway, to summarize his part in this. Our commitment to shared democratic values is what distinguishes NATO from other military alliances, he says. Without it, NATO is just another military bloc, spelled bloc wrong in this case, that opposes Russia. But this commitment cannot remain purely aspirational or rhetorical. It must be operationalized. And I think he had a little more to say. There are divisions and units within NATO dedicated to collective defense, terrorism, hybrid warfare, cyber, climate change, and all these other security challenges. But after 72 years, this is going back to 2022 when this resolution was passed. So this is, I'm using somewhat older quotes, even though he reiterated this stuff in Washington this past week. But after 72 years at that time, there's not even a broom closet in NATO headquarters dedicated to democratic institution building. So this center, he says, is long overdue. So that was among the major announcements, guys, this past week. And we also have the political scene setter keynote by Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor for the Biden administration. These are all original photos I took through the wonders of screenshots. So no borrowed photos for this presentation. And I have a little bit of what Sullivan had to say. My notes were a little sketchy, so I hunted down the actual transcript. Here's his remarks in part, an excerpt. Allies have committed to collectively provide Ukraine with at least 40 billion euros worth of security assistance over the next year. And that's not just a dollar sign, that is equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery, missiles, the whole range of capabilities that Ukraine needs in this case to effectively fight and win, he's saying. Think of that in the context of your earlier report. Next, in partnership with our allies, Sullivan also announced, we will provide Ukraine with 5 strategic air defense systems and dozens of tactical systems that are especially relevant to help protect Ukrainian forces on the front lines. Sullivan added, the strategic air systems will help Ukraine as it endures a continued pounding by Russia of its energy grid with Russian missiles and drones and a continued assault on its front lines by Russian planes. So these were some, not all, but some of the main things that Mr. Sullivan announced and will continue. He also said, from our own production, we'll deliver hundreds of critical air defense systems to Ukraine over the next year as well. There was a point earlier this year when it looked like Ukraine might run out of interceptors, but thanks to decisions that Biden has taken, working with allies and partners, will ensure that Ukraine remains supplied with the air defense missiles it needs for all of the batteries that we and our allies are now providing. Together, the U.S., Denmark, and the Netherlands have begun also the transfer of F-16s to Ukrainian forces, and Ukrainian pilots will be operating in theater with those F-16s, he says, this coming summer. The summer that we're in.
The man's deluded, Mark. They haven't got a chance.
It's
Could well be. I'm just the reporter here, and it's interesting in light of what we were showing earlier, the actual battle scenes, the overhead shots. We also have assessing the evolving threat of terrorism. I won't go into extravagant detail. The Trump assassination attempt that we reportedly heard about kind of knocked me off course a little bit. I was going to go a little bit deeper into NATO for this report. So I'm calling this NATO Part 1 of the summit this past week. Next week, I'll do Part 2. So I don't have all the details I otherwise would have had because of the Trump event. But here we have Nicholas Rasmussen. He is with Department of Homeland Security, and a NATO official, Thomas Goffis. I don't have his immediate affiliation handy, but they were talking about non-kinetic threats to NATO, primarily, guys. And by non-kinetic threats, that means malinformation, disinformation, misinformation, non-state actors, as well as state actors that would disrupt NATO's operations, that would threaten Western democracy by threatening NATO. And one thing that came up, and they were more like oblique references. They weren't real concrete, but there were these oblique references to colonizers and alternative news sources online that are upsetting the democratic system, knocking it out of whack, these kind of comments. And so one wonders which news colonizers online they might be talking about. But that came up in the terrorism context in that slide that was just shown. And here we also have just some photos that I also took to show sort of a montage of what took place. We have the Swedish Defense Minister, Pal Johnson, the Canadian Defense Minister, William Blair, and Finland's Defense Minister is shown below there. I'm not going to take a stab at maybe pronouncing his name, but there was a lot of discussion about Sweden and Finland just joining NATO and some of the ramifications of that. I'll talk a little bit more about that next week. And this was an interesting one, the NATO EU Partnership. And I've got a little bit more detail on that. One of the things that came up between Joseph Borrell, who is a high commissioner of the EU to NATO. I believe that's his position. Correct me if I'm wrong. And between him and the moderator, they were saying the mind is the battlefield. So some of this discussion was similar to the evolving terrorist threats, the non-kinetic threats, the malinformation, disinformation. Some similar themes came up. People are invading the networks, colonizing the minds of others, quote unquote. And this gentleman, Mr. Borrell, said it's absurd that Russia has saved the people of the Donbass region. He was the only person that even alluded to what Putin might be up to what Putin's motivations might be. But he no sooner brought it up than he shot it down. Putin couldn't possibly be defending the Donbass region. He's simply an aggressor. These sorts of things. And Borrell also mentioned 110 billion euro was recently expended for Ukraine, of which 40% is direct military assistance. And here's the thing. He claimed that in Ukraine, there are some 200 factories making thousands of pizza-sized drones, producing thousands of them a day, and each one holds 4 kilograms of explosives that can kill a tank. And my question would be, wouldn't those be among the very first things that Russian forces would destroy? So that was a little bit difficult to believe if you think about it tactically from the Russian standpoint. Now, much more could be said. We can talk a little bit more, of course, in extra about this and the Trump affair. This next slide, just to wind up, are just some notes. They said there was Q&A. I kept sending questions from time to time. I didn't get a single question answered. They even told me that there's only certain times that questions would be answered, but I didn't see hardly anyone else's questions addressed either. So the public forum's promises of addressing public questions was sorely lacking, and the public was largely just a spectator. So we'll leave it there for now, and we can talk more next week and at Extra today.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, I find that a really interesting combination. A defensive, inverted commas, military organisation, NATO, is now going to be working for peace and democracy in the world. Does that make you feel comfortable?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely not. Okay, well, should we trust British politicians?